months to political party primaries for Nigeria's 2027 general election, the National Assembly is now in a race against time to pass the new Electoral Act that will guide the process.
Now, the Senate and House of Representatives committees on electoral matters have opted to draft an entirely new act rather than amend the existing one, which was only passed into law in 2022.
Stakeholders welcomed this decision, which aims at reducing the constant amendments to the electoral legal framework that often create confusion among judges, practitioners and stakeholders in interpreting and applying electoral law.
Now, here, after, collating inputs from stakeholders and the public, the National Assembly Joint Committee are expected to prepare their reports and present separately in both chambers for consideration and passage.
Well, the new Electoral Act criminalizes vote buying and selling as an offense, in addition to buying and selling voters' cards. Also attracts a penalty of 5 million naira or 2 years imprisonment and 10 years disqualification from contesting in any election.
That's a good move. And under the Electoral Act amendments, issues of creating a body to conduct local government election, reducing minimum age limit to 30 years for candidates seeking governorship and senatorial seats, in addition to contentious vote trading, are to be examined. And on this, I welcome you to Good Morning Nigeria today. I am Jummai yourself.
And I'm here on Radio. I join Jummai to welcome you to the program. This is Good Morning Nigeria, reaching you live on the network service of the NTA. We're right here at our headquarters in Abuja. In the course of the program,
you're watching Good Morning Nigeria, and just before we bring in our guest, for this conversation on Electoral Act amendments, let's take this background report put together by Oyeyemi Ajayi.
Over time, reviews and reforms of the electoral laws and regulations have become common. The Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, and the National Assembly have reformed election laws before and after every general election to address the flaws experienced in previous elections and expect a better outcome subsequently. Recently, there has been the clamor and move about the electoral law amendment, which many say is long overdue. Efforts towards its effect have been on with the National Assembly that seem not to be backing down. The bill for an act to repeal the Electoral Act No. 13, 2022 and enact the Electoral Act 2025 features sweeping changes designed to improve transparency, litigation, timelines and voter participation. Fresh provisions contained in the new draft include giving INEC the power to use electronic transmission of results, early voting for groups whose election day duties prevent them from voting, and the introduction of voting rights for inmates in correctional centers. Aside these, the legislation proposes the establishment of an autonomous body, the National Independent Local Government Electoral Commission, NILGEC, tasked with the conducting of elections for the 774 local governments in Nigeria's 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory, FCT. The commission would consist of a chairperson and 6 commissioners, all appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, serving a 5-year term with the possibility of renewal. Sponsored by the chairman of the Senate Committee on Finance, Senator Sani Musa, one of the central tenets of the bill is the independence of NILGEC. It is expected to operate free from external influence and interference, with its budget approved by the National Assembly to ensure financial autonomy. This is aimed at divorcing local government elections from political manipulation and enhance public confidence in the electoral process at the grassroots level. The Nigerian House of Representatives also recently passed a constitutional amendment bill to reduce the age limit for contesting governorship and senatorial elections from the current 35 years to 30 years. It is believed that the existing constitutional provisions hinder young lawmakers who begin their political careers early but struggle to transition to higher offices, and so 30 years of age limit now gives chances for more younger politicians. Vote trading or vote buying is actually another move the National Assembly is working against, and it's one of their efforts to eradicate. Now, can we say this is a watershed in Nigeria's electoral process? When eventually passed, how well would this be absorbed and acted upon during elections? Our guests already seated will be answering these questions and more shortly.
Many thanks to Yemi Ajayi for that background report. Now time to introduce our guest, and with us right here in the studio is Jide Ojo, a public affairs analyst. It's a pleasure to have you with us, sir.
It's my pleasure, Elaine.
Looking dapper than ever.
Thank you so much for the compliment.
I don't know if today is the mafia or is it Italian.
And neither of the two. But let's thank God for grace to be alive.
It's a pleasure to see you.
My pleasure, Jumai.
And also joining us via Zoom from Kaduna studio is Dr. Aliu Yero, a political analyst. You're welcome to Good Morning Nigeria.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning. And joining us via Zoom is Cynthia Mbamalu, Director Programs Yaga Africa. Cynthia, good to see you this morning.
Thank you, and good morning. Good morning, Nigeria.
Good morning, Nigeria. Let's quickly go to, let's begin with you, Mr. Jide. What do you make of the not amending, but having a whole new Electoral Act itself? What do you make of it? Do we have time?
Well, there will always be time to do the right thing, but I'm not too comfortable with having wholesale Electoral Act so soon after the last one. We had the last one in 2022. The previous one, which was Electoral 2010, we used that for 12 years, 3 electoral cycles. Now we have barely used this current one for 1 electoral cycle, and then we are discarding the entire thing and promulgating another one. And should I say our problem is entirely not legislation or law, but lack of strict adherence to implementation. When the I was involved in the advocacy for the Electoral 2022. And we thought it was a game changer. It was the best thing to happen after the birth of Jesus Christ and Muhammad. It was going to give us credible election and all of that. But the operators ended up doing what? Finding loopholes to, undermine the process. And that is the nature and character of our political class. The immediate past INEC chairman will say you can never legislate attitude. Because people, when they have this attitude that it's either my way or highway, this pull him down, pull her down syndrome in our politics of winner takes all, politics of zero-sum game, politics of I must always win, and not the spirit of sportsmanship that in every sporting context, somebody must win, somebody must lose. And so when you continue to have fetishism of legislation, it shows that you are jittery. Because when you look at the American system, America has been running electoral democracy for about 250 years. How many times have they amended their laws, or their constitution or electoral laws? In fact, in the United States, which have been privileged to observe election, they have a very highly decentralized system. In fact, the states conduct elections, excuse me, and those elections are conducted by a partisan Secretary of State, who are either Republican or Democrats. Yet the system, because there is a trust in the system, they care less. For the exception of Donald Trump, who said the 2020 election was stolen, almost every other person accepted the verdict. And even that election, which Donald Trump claimed was stolen, went through the legal process and was validated. So I think we need to exercise caution that our National Assembly has now made legislation or legal reform or electoral reform a kind of fetishism, where they will spend 2-3 years, going around the country, spending billions of naira, talking to different stakeholders. We know what the issues are.
Do we have 2 to 3 years before the 2022 2027 election? Do we have that time?
We don't even have the time. I've challenged them. You want to do X, Y, Z. This is November ending. By the time the president submits the budget for 2026, all eyes will be on the appropriation bill. At what time do you want to conclude this electoral reform for it to be for us to have a kind of piloting of the implementation ahead of, because when I hear people saying, oh, let's go electronic voting. If you are going to do electronic voting, Juma and Leon, you must procure the machines. They are not on the shelves. They are not manufactured in Nigeria. You have to get the funding. Then you have to do selection of vendors. Then you have to wait a period of time for the delivery. Then you have to do pilot. You can't roll out 100% on a general election day. What if there are issues? So where is the time? We barely have 1 year to the next election. Don't be deceived that we are in 2025, because the next electoral cycle is in February, March 2027. So if you do the subtraction, we barely have 13 to 14 months
All right, many
for
thanks.
the next election.
Many thanks, Jide Ojo. You say the next electoral cycle is February to March, but there's a proposal to shift that to November. That's also another
Don't
issue.
even think about that. That will not fly. If that is going to fly, and that is part of the coup d'etat the National Assembly is working themselves into, when they said they want to bring the election back 6 months so that all election petition can be concluded within before inauguration, and they are suggesting November 2026. According to the electoral act, you have to give 1 year notice. Are we going to give that notice when the legislation has not been passed, or have they thought about funding in one fell swoop, needing, maybe INEC will be asking for 1 trillion? Will you be able to give? Now INEC's budget will go into the national budget that is going to be submitted to them. So a lot of booby traps are there.
All right.
But I'm just putting that on the table. Our problem is not essentially legislation, but implementation and attitude of the political class.
Thank you very much, Jide Ojo. While you were speaking, we had joined us for the conversation Amsfree Ajanako, Executive Director at Grassroots Center for Rights and Civic Orientation. Many thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right,
for having
so
me.
we'll go to Cynthia now before we return to the studio and, of course, engage Amsfree Ajanako. Cynthia, I'd like to hear your thoughts about this. Mr. Ojo says, all of this is not necessary. But speak to us. Do you think there are actually some concerns in the Electoral Act that, we need a complete overhaul of the whole electoral process, and this is the right move?
Well, I would say there is a need for the Electoral Act amendment for 3 major reasons. The first, we operate in a very mischievous political system where simple things are complicated, and so even when you have a provision that gives INEC powers to do certain things, you have a court interpretation undermining such powers or raising questions on the appearance of the powers or the presence of the power. The second is that when it comes to legal drafting, there is the need for a lot more clarity to reduce legal ambiguities in the law, and so that's one of the reasons that this could be a consideration. And I think the third reason is that there is a growing decline of trust in our electoral process and institution, and so the process of reform can also be a process to re-inspire trust if it is done properly and if it is done timelessly. And so for me, these are 3 important reasons why this is a conversation that we should be having. But I think I'll begin with the first. And I think on that part, I would agree with some of the points made by Mr. Jide Ojo, because the truth is, in other climes, with the Electoral Act that we have, if we want to conduct and have a good elections, if we want to conduct transparent, quality elections that can inspire trust, we can achieve that. And why do I say that? One of the very contentious issues from the last general election circle, and currently, it's the provision around the electronic transmission of results. In the last electoral reform circle, we did believe that INEC now had the power to transmit elections results electronically, that INEC was empowered to have that parallel system of electronic transmission of results in addition to the manual process when it comes to results management in such a way that would inspire confidence and promote transparency in the electoral process. And 2023 happened, and the elections tribunal gave its verdict. And if you remember, the Supreme Court's decision basically undermined that power in the Electoral Act. And even though the Electoral Act had just given INEC a general power, and INEC made steps and provided steps for the process of result management in its guideline, which INEC by the Electoral Act has the power to design and develop its own guidelines and manuals for elections regulations. But it was almost like the court saying that INEC was not necessarily bound by its own guideline. It was focusing more on the Electoral Act provision, which is why I said in other climes, with the legal framework we have, things would be done differently, because if you want to interpret, it's just like saying, for instance, CBN is not bound by its regulation. When CBN releases its regulation, every financial institution, including the CBN itself, is bound by it. But when it comes to elections, we've seen consistently when INEC meets its guidelines to regulate the elections, because that's where you provide the nitty-gritties on the process. But then when it comes to the process, if INEC for some instance sidesteps or steps and sets aside a part of it, and citizens believe that, oh, you should have followed your own procedure, your own rules, there is no guarantee that the court will say, oh, you are bound by your rules because the act says you can do this and you can stick to that. Why am I giving this context? The reason you have a lot of agitation is now we're saying, okay, let's go back to the Electoral Act. If when it comes to interpretation, there's always a focus or emphasis on the Electoral Act, and most times the guideline is not part of the conversation. Can we then introduce better provisions that provide clarity in the Electoral Act? And so if you look at the provisions in the Electoral Act 2022 around transmission of results, there is a lot more ambiguity and some poor cross-referencing in that Electoral Act, which is why one major issue in this new proposed bill is clarity on the electronic transmission of results in such a way that it is part of the system, and it is now provided. If you look at the bill, it's provided in clear terms that when it comes to collation, there is a manual process, there is the electronic process, and where there is a conflict at collation, the collation officer is compare what has been transmitted electronically with that has been manual, and that has been transmitted electronically is even giving some level of premium when it comes to, or how would I put it, importance when it comes to comparing or dealing with inconsistencies in numbers. And so that's one of the things I'm looking forward to, that clarity, so that when it comes to electronic election administration, every Nigerian stakeholders and even the Electoral Commission is clear that this is what the process is. And if you step aside the process in the conduct of elections, we also show that the court to say, okay, the Electoral Act now provides for it. And so that's one. The second is, like I said, when I say we complicate simple issues, because honestly, I'm tired of this consistent season of electoral reforms. But the truth is, because our system we make, like I said, simple things complex, it's important that now in the Electoral Act, we are clearly providing for processes that would regulate the conduct of our elections. And so one major issue, there are several sections around the electronic transmission of results. The other issues that you have in the Electoral Act are things around the proposals for conduct of local government elections. If you remember that the Electoral Act 2022 provides a legal framework to regulate how local elections are conducted, because the intention was that states would then amend their electoral laws to review the process of local government elections to be in line with the Electoral Act procedure for elections. And so now there are proposals to provide clarity, because we've also seen Supreme Court decisions on local elections and different application of rules, a lot of confusion at the level of the CX. And so there are specific reviews to provide more clarity on what what procedure in particular would be applicable to local government elections. But then there are bigger issues around cleaning up some sections. If you look at the last electoral, there were actually some issues around poor cross-referencing. So some sections refer to another section to guide for guidance. You go to that particular section, it's not speaking to what is being referred to. And so there is also that thing about cleaning it up, which is why you'd hear things like a whole new. It's not necessarily that we're changing everything or like the electorate is being, because I'm taking a look at the bill, it's just there's a lot more issues around cleaning it up. And then some of the sections are reviewed. There are proposals that were pushed for things like early voting. There are still conversations around that, and we're hoping that goes through early voting for election day workers, security personnel that work on elections, the officials of INEC and media practitioners. But I think for me, the bigger and then things around the direct primaries. Yes, the primary is one, because if you remember the last electoral act, some members of political parties could not vote in indirect primaries, especially those occupying offices in the national assemblies and other elective offices. And so there's a political interest to review that particular section to ensure that they can all serve as delegates in the next electoral elections and primaries and party primaries that will be conducted next year. And so those are important issues. But where am I coming from? Which is where I like I said, there was a point Mr. Jide made that it's not necessarily about reforming the process. It's also about the character of the political class, because you can reform and review your electoral act to make it to promote transparency in the process. But if the political class, if they do not have a reformed political culture to engage the electoral process, we will still keep going round this vicious circle. Because the problem with our political class is not necessarily that they do not understand the law, they do not understand the spirit behind the law and the importance of a transparent system, is that they want to win elections at all costs. So they are looking for exceptions to the rules, they are looking for ways to undermine the integrity of the process. And so you can reform the process, we can have a whole new electoral act for the next electoral cycle. But if it's this same character of political actors that we have, if they do not engage the electoral process from the mindset of promoting and strengthening our democracy, then we're still going to come back after 2027 and start looking for ways to review the process. And maybe my last point at this initial stage would be, need to start pushing for an independent judiciary. Why do I say so? We've seen in other countries, I mean, as simple as Kenya, where the courts, where in its interpretation, can either inspire confidence in the process or destroy the confidence in the process. And now we need a judicial arm of government that understands its role as an institution that safeguards and protects our constitutional democracy, meaning that in interpretations of law and in electoral matters, we want to see a lot more discipline in how laws are interpreted and a lot more consciousness in promoting the power of the vote that the voters have cast at the polling unit, in protecting and safeguarding that. Because if you have a court that the citizens do not trust in, it also affects the strength or the growth of our our electoral democracy. And so, like I said, it's not necessarily about the reforms or changing the new laws. It's also about the character of stakeholders and actors that will be engaging with this electoral act as we move into the next electoral cycle.
Cynthia, thank you so much. You've touched on so many points, and people are of the opinion that most Nigerians don't even understand the present electoral act, and we're going in for a new one. It's a whole new ball game, actually. Let's bring in Dr. Yero into this conversation from our Kaduna studio. Critics, sort of argue that frequent, amendments to the Electoral Act will weaken, the stability of the electoral matters in Nigeria. And some are saying that it is just being politically motivated by politicians to suit them. So what's your opinion? Okay, let's join Amsri Ajanaku. You've listened to Jide Ojo, you've listened to
Very,
Cynthia.
very erudite
Well, the Electoral Act was just passed in 2022, and most Nigerians don't even understand it. The section by section, like Cynthia said, a section refers you to another section. When you get there, it does not even address the section that you were, trying to understand. Trying to understand all these acts and sections and all that. It's difficult for some people, and now they're saying that it's not just amendment. We want a whole new Electoral Act itself, standing on its own. And Cynthia is saying the judiciary also needs independence to be able to function properly.
Absolutely. My two very erudite colleagues have really hit the nail. And I think that we have always grappled with that whole reality that we practice a democracy without democrats. And so when you have that kind of contradiction, what is generally going to happen is that you are going to focus on a lot of legal reform. You keep on engaging in legal reform endlessly, and those legal reform, as laudable as they are, may not translate into the real outcomes. And so this is the dilemma that we face in our democracy. And we can also see that dilemma also translating in the lack of interest we see in the process. And I give you an example from data. AMAC, where we are sitting in the last FCT area council election, recorded a turnout of 5.3%. And so you had a situation in a ward like Gwarimpa where councillors were elected by 2,000 people. That is what the data shows. I mean, INEC has all these results well curated for us to mine and get all these insights. So having said that, if I want to support the ongoing talk about legal reform, what I will be looking at is what aspects of the process will take away from the electoral bureaucracy and put power in the hands of citizens. Because if we just talk about reform in the context of putting more powers, putting more money, putting more equipment in INEC, and in the process, certain aspects of even the Electoral Act itself, even disempower citizens, and then even constrains their participation in the process, then we're not really making any progress. And so, for me, one of the core mandates of my organization is citizens orientation. And you talked about lack of understanding of the Electoral Act by citizens. And I look at the aspect that has to do with voter education, for example. Engaging the voters to understand their role in the democratic process and to robustly participate and ensure democratic accountability. And the way we can go about that in the course of the current push for reform of the legal framework is to look at where the responsibility for something like voter education sits currently. It sits with INEC, but INEC is not the only agency responsible. And it is very commendable that an organization like YAGA, for example, put out a citizens memorandum, which in the aspect of voter education says that we should not just focus on INEC when it comes to engaging the citizens in terms of how to vote. We are seeing a lot of cases of, void, ballots, people not really understanding, how to, the technicality of voting, where their votes should sit, and a lot of issues like that. And so, an organization like National Orientation Agency, and if you ask them, they tell you they don't have the budget to engage citizens in these issues.
What about the politicians? If they can buy the votes, can't they create awareness for their voters too?
Exactly. So that whole of government, whole of society approach to ensuring that the citizens become engaged in the electoral process is actually critical. And of course, the political parties themselves, understanding that they have a stake, as well as the citizens, to ensure that they get the message across to citizens to participate in the process. So if we are able to do that, if this reform is able to achieve that, for me, that will be satisfactory when I would come with the realization that in 2027, more Nigerians will participate. We will see an uptick in the level of citizens engaging in the process, and then that is also translating
All
into
right.
democratic accountability.
Many thanks, Amsfree Janako. You said we're practicing a democracy without Democrats. So is it Republicans we have, or what sort of people do we have?
Yes. So it's not Democrats in the sense of ideology, but Democrats in the essential sense of fidelity to a democratic process. And my very senior colleague Jide Ojo has actually encapsulated what this contradiction is, where people do not believe the outcome of a process, even though they know they've lost. Some would say the reason for that is the excessively high stakes, the fact that campaigns are expensive, the stakes for political office is so huge that nobody wants to lose out. But in the end, we need to develop a democratic culture where people realize that when the people decide, it is for you to exhibit that spirit of sportsmanship.
All right.
That has been the bane of the current democratic system we have.
Many thanks. A lot of people would also argue: do the people actually decide when we have elections? Do the people actually decide? So many proposals in the new electoral amendments. Dr. Yero, I'm sure that you're with us and your mic has been unmuted. So I'd like to get to you. So many proposals. I mean, the Electoral Act amendment, whether Mr. Jide Ojo likes it or not, of course, will continue. The National Assembly is bent on the whole process, and like Cynthia said, some sections are like we know we need some kind of amendment. The proposals, some are saying that we should have same-day election. I mean, for all elections in the country. There's also the call for early voting for a certain group of individuals. Do you support that move? There's also a call that we can use our names and all of that, optional PVCs and all of that. So I would like you to speak about the proposals, for the new Electoral Act. Do you think that these are credible causes? Do you think that we should go in this way and it will actually change the whole landscape in our electoral process?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, Nigeria, once again. I believe that our last election have showed us that we really needed to have these reforms, whether reforms or changing the whole Electoral Act, but there is the need for reforms. And the fundamental reason why these reforms are important is because there are certain segments of Nigerians who are eligible to vote but are not being able to vote. So, for example, when you say early voting for people who work in critical sectors that may be on duty on the election day and they may not be able to vote, it's very important because it's allowing them to have the opportunity to vote when you create this room for early voting. Of course, if you look at our local government elections today, they are perhaps one of the most less credible, I would say, because there are so many issues around local government elections. So if any reform comes that will allow room for a more credible local government elections, of course, is good. So what I'm saying actually is that the reforms are very important. In fact, our last elections from the day one of coalition, we saw fundamental flaws that showed that our Electoral Act is still ambiguous, that there are still areas where we assumed that, votes could be, electronically transmitted and eligible. But then, from day one of the coalition, and I say, we may or may not, recognize IRF, numbers. So these are issues that are very fundamental and they deal with the credibility of the elections. And these reforms are necessary as soon as possible. If you remember in previous times, there were times when the president, then late President Muhammad Buhari, even refused to sign the amendments to the electoral because he claimed it is too late. So of course, we need to act fast. We need to do this earlier, or else these reforms that are supposed to improve the credibility of the elections will in turn start to look like, suspicious and trying to make it look like it is even trying to undermine the credibility of the elections. So instead of wasting time, we would have done these, amendments earlier to capture segments of Nigerians, of course, the diaspora. If you talk about even people living with disabilities, all these categories of people need to be captured. And so if reforms will give room for everybody to be able to participate in the process, then this is very fundamental and necessary. And of course, these elections we are talking about, we are saying our democracy itself and the credibility of our leaders is built on them being able to be elected through a credible process. And if the process is suspicious or seen to be not credible enough, then even the people elected into offices will seem to have less legitimacy to the claim of offices they are holding. So I mean, I'm very worried about the slow pace these reforms are going, but of course these fundamental areas that have been identified are very necessary, and that without reforming this electoral act now, we are risking throwing the election into chaos. And also I'm worried about this youth that we have today in Nigeria. If this reforms does not add credibility to the elections, we are afraid the youth in particular, the youth generation may decide to stay away from the elections. And this will make it less participatory for a very huge number of Nigerians that are supposed to be the ones to own the process. And this process is supposed not to be amended by them, but to be amended by a certain group of politicians, which all the discussants have said, there's a level of, delay we are seeing, which makes it look suspicious, because perhaps...
Thanks. Many thanks for your insight. But you see, you just talked about credibility. And then so far, from what Jide Ojo has said, Amsria Janaku and Cynthia, the credibility of the electoral process is not really about what's on paper. It's about the attitude of the actors themselves. Now, why would this electoral act, if it's, finally gets to the last stage, bring credibility you're talking about? The early voting you have also, supported. Some say that would be a room for, manipulations, because where do you want to keep the results of, those who have voted 2 weeks before an election? What's the guarantee it won't be altered? What's the guarantee that result will not be used to alter the whole election, in general? So is it not about the attitude? Is it about what's on paper?
It is not necessarily that the attitude is not important. The attitude is important. In fact, without the political will, the political culture, the elections, whether early voting or no early voting, it doesn't make any difference. As long as we get our political class to accept the fact, because these laws are what will guide the elections. And so if these laws, we get them right, even if there are issues, the whole process of litigations will be more clearer and easier to address. When people vote early, of course, as long as we get the right, the process right, the laws right, this is not the first time. In certain climes, we have people voting few months even to elections. And you cannot assume that these people should not be allowed to vote early just because we are worried about the credibility. Of course, whether they vote early or whether the votes were done on the election day, still the issue of credibility cannot be ruled out. Of course, that's why I said, I suspect, I feel there is a deliberate attempt to delay the process, because perhaps loopholes may not want to see the laws put in place to cover those loopholes that they rely on to win elections. So of course the attitude is very important. But look, the laws matter. And this is where people can go to courts and get their, rights protected and their votes protected. So the laws are very important. Very important. When you break
Thank you, Dr. Yoro. The laws are very important, and Mr. Jido Ojo, it is the political class that makes the law. It's still the political class that
break the law.
Break the law. So now they are thinking of let's go deeper into the new Electoral Act that they're talking about, proposing a national commission, to conduct local government elections, which used to be situated in the sub-nationals with the state. Do you think the state governors would accept that? And why a national commission? Why don't you use INEC? Why multiplicity of agencies? It sort of dampens the spirit of the electorate in believing in the credibility of the process itself.
Thank you, Jumai. See, I've been on the field for 22 years now. As an active participant in the electoral process, but I've been observing election in Nigeria since 1999. So that makes 26 years. But observing election and working actively was since 2002. So you said something which is very, very key. The political class makes the law, and they deliberately undermines the law. So whether you make law to set up an independent commission to conduct local government elections, who is going to conduct that election? Is it not the political class that will enable? See, when I was in my 9-to-5 job, before I went into full-time consultancy, my office partnered to give technical support to different stakeholders in the electoral process, from INEC to political parties and candidates and all of that. What I've discovered is sometimes we do things for the purposes of self-interest, majorly self-interest, not national interest. Because all this old fetishism about reforming legislation is not going to lead us anywhere. God will spare our lives. After 2027 election, we will still sit at this and say, there's this aspect that we still need to fix. Why are we fixing? Do you know how much the budget of National Assembly on electoral reform is? Go and check out. Billions. This is December. They are still holding consultative meeting. November, consultative meeting. Meanwhile, we ran into the same problem ahead of 2023, when the president eventually signed the bill in February 2022. INEC have to shift the date of election by another week, if you remember, from the earlier announced date, because it has to give 1 year notice. Are we not walking into the same trap? This is November ending. By next week, we are in December, and then you face budget, and then there are two things going on I should draw our attention to: constitutional alteration and electoral reform. And some of the constitutional alteration will impact on the Electoral Act. And we are not following the sequence, because if you even pass the Electoral Act now, and you eventually pass the Constitution, you have to still make further amendment to bring the Constitution, to bring the Electoral Act in sync with the Constitution. I don't know whether I'm making sense.
Yeah, making sense.
So right now, the National Assembly has not even passed the constitutional alteration. They have not. They are still doing consultation. Yesterday on your station, I heard they said they are meeting with the governors for their own input. This is last week of November. So by the time they eventually start maybe middle of next month they will sit and then pass whichever one they want to pass in the constitutional alteration. Don't forget, it doesn't lie with only them at the National Assembly.
Middle of next month, they will be in recess for the festivities.
Before they go on recess, they might even rush to pass, assuming without considering that they will rush before they go on recess, pass the alteration, and then send to the office of the clerk and work out the details. When we return in January, then they will do what? They will now send it to the State House of Assembly. Meanwhile, the National Assembly cannot dictate to the 36 states when to pass their own version. And by the time, because one state will pass their own in February, another will pass their own in June. By the time they have to aggregate, is any clause that meets 2/3 that will be amended. So until all the 36 states have now voted on those constitutional alteration amendments, that's when it will be brought back, articulated, and sent to the president for assent. Now, why is timing? Because I also heard Dr. Yero talking about timing and sequence. Why is it so important? This is alluding to what my brother, he was quoting Professor Klodake, who said, we are running democracy without Democrats. People who have self-interest, primarily, not about national interest, it's about winning the next election. And they deliberately will put the booby trap that will undermine the gaps, the loopholes that they can use to escape. Now, on the issue of the national the body for conducting local government elections, we don't need it. We simply don't need it. This was an argument that since 2008, when Presidential Committee on Electoral Reform, headed by Justice Muhammad Lawal Uwais, when they recommended integration of SIEC into INEC, and that INEC should conduct all the elections. But the governors kicked against it, which is what you said earlier. Would the governors allow for that?
Yes.
They will not. And what the midpoint which the governors at that time agree with former President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua was that, okay, we will not force it on you, but go and do consequential amendments like has been done to empower INEC. What is this? Why is SIEC failing that we are not seeing much of credible elections?
Because of the influence of governors.
No, let me quickly land on that. The reason is that they don't have financial autonomy, they don't have administrative autonomy. And if you fix these two, you may end up seeing that in other climes, it's the state that conducts elections, not the federal. But in our own case, you refuse to fund. I was at a workshop that was organized for Forum of State Independent Electoral Commissions. And one of the chairmen, then, it was over 10 years ago, then said he wanted to do election in his state. And he sent in a budget of, 1 billion for the conduct. And then the State House of Assembly cut the budget to 300 million. And when they sent the budget, I said, this is what you are. He said, he just kept quiet. Then later, the governor called him. Mr. Chairman, you have not announced the date for election. He said, well, Mr. Governor, which senatorial district should we start from? Maybe we'll conduct it senatorial district by senatorial district. Because what you have given me is money for one of the senatorial districts. I don't have the full complement of resources that can give me, a statewide election. And eventually, they negotiated and more money was given. So in a situation where you do not have you are not well resourced, both in terms of human personnel, office space, and even the funding to do the logistics and operations of election, you cannot but expect what you are seeing with the State Independent Electoral Commission. So even if you set up another commission, and that commission is not on first line charge, like INEC was put after the 2010 amendment, because people forget that when Professor Maurice, who was the national chairman of INEC, he wanted to do voter registration in 2006. He needed 34,000 DDC machines. did you know that funding was not released? And as at the September 2006, INEC only had 1,000 machines out of 34 or 33,000 that was requested. Why? Because there was no funding. But the luck Professor Atahiru Jega had was that by 2010, when he came on board, INEC's, there have been constitutional amendment which now put INEC on first line charge on Consolidated Revenue Fund of the Federation, as well as guarantee not only financial autonomy but administrative autonomy. And let me make that comparison. Professor Ibu wanted to buy 33,000 DDC machine. Professor Atahiru Jega decided to buy 120,000 DDC machine to conduct fresh voter registration in 2010 ahead of 2011. He got the money. He got the money. One wanted to buy how many? 33,000. He didn't receive funding on time. There was delay. And that's why you saw the voter register of 2006 containing names of Michael Jackson, Muhammad Ali, and the rest.
People
were cutting almanac and were taking pictures and all of that. But when Professor Atahiru Jega came on board, because of the alteration of the constitution to give the commission financial and administrative autonomy, he was able to procure over 130,000 DDC machine, and he did one DDC machine per one polling unit. And that was why the 2011 was better conducted. He wanted to do smart card reader. He got the funding to do smart card reader, and that was why in 2015, President Buhari said, but for smart card reader, he may never have won the election. So when you look at the fate of state independent electoral commissions, the fact that there is no state independent electoral commission, to the best of my knowledge, that are functional local government offices. But INEC in Abuja has not just INEC, they have 37 state offices, they have 774 local government offices that are functional, where there are electoral officers across the board.
Now, if you say that INEC is well equipped, both with personnel,
better resourced, not
better resourced,
Yeah,
why have we not seen better general elections?
No, we have seen. See, perception is what you are dealing with. Someone loses the election and said the election is bad, it's not well conducted. But let me advise the minds of many of our viewers to one section of the Electoral Act. Election will not be invalidated on the basis that there are certain discretion or certain flaws or imperfections. It's only when it is widespread. I don't know whether I'm making sense. It's different from, when we went to Gwarimpa, we saw a vote buying, or we saw violence, or we saw issues. You understand? There are 176,000 plus polling units. Larry, if there are issues in 1,000, assuming without considering that there are issues with 1,000, and you as a media practitioner went and covered and saw that there is violence, there is manipulation of results, and then you report it, you cannot use that isolated incidents to generalize for the 176,000 plus polling units. So for a politician who loses, the election will never be credible. But for the one who wins, the election is credible. So while I agree that our election is still work in progress, I will not subscribe to the fact that we have not been having credible elections. Because credibility of election is issues around perception. Let me give you the issue of uploading results on IREF. Yes, it's in the guideline. Did INEC eventually upload the result? The answer is yes. Was it done in a timeous manner? The answer was no. Do you get? Now, some people now believe because it was not uploaded in a timeous manner, the result may have been altered. But when they went to court, nobody was able to conflict and contradict the fact that the eventual results that were uploaded were in sync with what the copies that each of the party agents got. Even when Yaga Africa said election in Rivers and I think Nasarawa, that it didn't correspond with their own projection. Now, this is two states. These are 2 states out of 36. If you subtract 2 out of 36, will you say that election has failed? If you score 75 in an election, in an exam, will you get A or you get B?
Okay, Mr.
I'll get an A.
You
Definitely.
get an A, but you
Yes.
didn't score 100%.
Yes, Mr. Jide, you not score 100% indeed. Thank you so much there. We're asking our viewers to send in your comments and anything you want to ask our guests seated here in the studio, but that will be after the break. We'll be able to read them out so that our guests will respond to them. We'll take a break now. When we return, Good Morning Nigeria continues. You're welcome back, and you're still watching Good Morning Nigeria. We have some messages that came in. Let me first take these ones before we go to Cynthia to respond to some of them and, of course, answer another question. Ikeju Olagbaju said the existing Electoral Act 2022 made enough provision to deal with basic issues of preparation, conduct transmission, and admission in the electoral process. The problem is the attitude of the political class or actors who hardly believe that there's always another day if they lose. I believe attitudinal change backed up with voters' education will benefit the system more than the amendment of the act. Hearing.
All right, we have more comments here. If you like questions from our viewers, just take a few. This one says, my name is Igwe Ifeanyi Emmanuel from Umweze Amaike Ziha Ohaku. I hope I got that right. Local government area of Ebonyi State. My view is that INEC should hold a town hall meeting with Nigerians to make their input on the way forward, not just a written document to the Senate, who only makes way for themselves. Good morning, Nigeria. Many thanks for that. This one says, good morning, Nigerians. National Assembly should simply erase electronic devices like Beavers and back-end server or electronic transfer of results conundrum. Because all of that has failed Nigerians and Nigeria in terms of effective and efficient electoral system based on results obtainable in the past and financial cost. Going forward, option A4, where eligible voters queue behind preferred candidates on election day, as was used in the aborted Third Republic in 1993, should be adopted for future elections, especially 2027 general election, until Nigerians are ready for a digital electoral system in the majority. Most importantly, security and welfare of INEC ad hoc staff and citizens going out to vote on election day should be prioritized by the federal government. Quite a lengthy message that you have sent here. I mean, this is really too long, but many thanks, Dennis Shima, political scientist and analyst in Abuja, sent that. This one says, Ahmed Baba Dikwa from Maiduguri. While a technically airtight electoral act is fundamental, its true strength lies in its consistent and impartial implementation by all stakeholders. Ultimately, it is the adherence to the rules of engagement by political actors that safeguards the integrity of our democracy. Another one here says, good morning, discussants and Nigerians from Umwifuru High Cent in Abakaliki. You're a regular contributor. Many thanks for this. This one says, Mr. Jide Ojo, there is right. Our problem is poor implementation of laws, not inadequacy of the laws. For instance, with the obnoxious immunities still shielding governors, of what use will be the amendment if a governor commits an electoral fraud? And for further protection, he jumps into the Senate at the end of his office tenure. And if he's not of the ruling party, he then defects. All this jeopardizes the implementation of the laws.
Yes.
I mean, this one says, actually, good morning. Transparency is the problem. Act or no act, amendment or no amendment. Please, let our leaders be transparent for the sake of humanity. That's coming from Amina Hamza in Abuja.
Yes, and another one, Kayode Busari from Lagos said, many thanks to the topic of discussion today. The major challenge, Jide Ojo has said it all, and I give it to him. The problem with the process is the people themselves, majorly the politicians, and we, the common people. All we need is fostering an orientating democratic culture in the country. Our politicians should learn to accept defeat honorably in the spirit of sportsmanship and not by force, by fire. We have to strengthen our institutions head on.
All right, let's get to Cynthia now. I'm sure you want to respond to some of this, but I mean, the Electoral Act, there are some, amendments they're looking at, talking about penalty, for example, for vote buying, electoral offenses and all of that. Isn't that, something credible that's about to happen with the amendment? And then I'd like you to react to some of the comments by our viewers so far.
Thank you. I mean, that Standards Nigerians I'm speaking, and I do believe when it comes to elections, I always say that for elections, perception is everything. And so if citizens perceive that the process is not transparent, no matter the English you speak, they would not trust the outcome of the elections, which is why when it comes to elections, the rules, what would be applicable in any other system or any other process wouldn't work. For elections, if you tell people you're going to do A, B, C, D, you have to ensure you do A, B, C, D. If you fail to do all four, you must explain in a timeless manner why you failed to do one. If not, it changes the whole game. And I think that is what we need to understand with the elections. But if you ask me the questions around the introduction, vote buying, the current Electoral Act already criminalizes vote buying. And so when people say it's novel, it's not novel, it's already in the act. The problem is it's implementation or enforcement, because already the act criminalizes undue influence in the electoral process. And so, sorry, can you?
Go ahead, continue. Cynthia, we can hear you.
Cynthia, we hope we can rectify that. Let's get to Dr. Yeri now. I would like to hear your thoughts on some of the comments by our viewers. And do you think that we should just abandon this Electoral Act and work on, the actors, maybe the politicians themselves, and see how to, impose penalties on them if they default?
Thank you very much. Of course, when people tamper with the laws and they are not accountable, or they are not held accountable, of course, there will be, people will not trust the process again. And of course, the election itself is a process, and the process must be seen to be credible, and that those who violate laws must be seen to be punished, or else the whole debate will crash. And that's why everybody in consensus is saying that it is about the implementation, not necessarily about the law. But I still feel the law is very important. I'm not saying it is over and above everything, but of course, if we get the laws right, this will make even those who don't have confidence in the process start to have confidence in the process, especially the group I spoke about earlier, which is the youth. The Nigerian youth are very smart today, and they are looking closely at this process, and they are a significant group that we need to carry along to ensure the sustenance and survival of our democracy. And so, of course, the laws must be there to show to the people that, yes, if there are any infringements, of course, the law will take its course. If you look at the 2015 elections, are we going to say the people are different? No, they are the same people. But of course, because the process and the system that was put in place was in a manner that, provided the room to ensure that the votes counted. And that was why, for the first time, everybody was clapping at Nigerians, because we were able to have a transition from one political party to another, peacefully. So the process is very important. The laws are very important. Of course, the people and the perception is very important, and it is shaped by many variables. And one of such variables is the Electoral Act itself. So therefore, the reforms are necessary, are very important, and of course, they are fundamental in guaranteeing that even the perception is changed, and that people see trust, people see credibility in the process, so that the elections will not be what we assume it will be without, having these laws amended. This is my opinion.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Yoro. Ansri, Dr. Yoro is in support of the younger generation. You know, we all know that almost 75% of eligible voters now are the young generation, and there's a new, I think, something in the Electoral Act that reduces the age of governorship and senatorial election to 30 years from 35. And you know, critics are saying that, is this another phase of not too young to run bill, or is it a political gimmick out there? And others are saying that the political class, are they ready for a younger leadership in Nigeria, and will the godfatherism factor hijack it altogether?
Absolutely. I think these issues are interconnected, and good enough, Yaga, which our organization also really looks up to in terms of what they have achieved with the Not Too Young to Run. They did a very phenomenal work in terms of how they pushed that advocacy and then, got that into the legal framework. But of course, how has that translated in terms of the output of younger politicians really going out there to be able to, take the stage and then get that whole representation at the national and even at the local level. So you would see that there's a mismatch in terms of the outcomes. And what is responsible for that is really very clear. The political process and the process of nomination in political parties has been priced away from the reach of, the historically marginalized groups. So whether you talk about the youth, you talk about women, you talk about people with disabilities. If you look at the nomination form of APC or PDP or any of these political parties today, how many honestly engaged youth that are earning their living legitimately can actually afford, some of the amounts we hear for nomination forms? So where you have a political process that has become so heavily monetized, and then you have a situation in which the people who should be able to come in with integrity, with ideas to drive the process, are not able to make an entry, even at the level of political party.
Godfathers give them the money to do that.
Yeah,
and then they control them.
Yes, they control them. And then I think that also feeds into the whole conversation about vote buying. Because in the typology of vote buying, we have wholesale vote buying. That's the type that Jide talked about, that Professor Soludo engaged in. Because what he did was, he did a wholesale buying of the votes. And on election day, we have retail vote buying. That one is the one that they do the see and buy, where people come to the polling units and bargain and negotiate and try to induce the voters.
Really?
So in that typology, you have to deal with it with, different perspective and different lenses. And then when you look at the political, because the political party process is critical in this conversation, because you cannot run away from, of course, our legal framework has not even in the current Electoral Act proposals for amendment, we have not seen independent candidacy. So everybody aspiring has to go through the gamut of a political party. And if you are going within the gamut of a political party, even as a youth, as a woman, and you're already priced out of the nomination process, you're already overawed by money bags, because vote buying also starts from the political parties. They buy delegates. We've seen it in this country where dollars, used to buy delegates. So when you have that heavily monetized political culture, then the kind of outcomes we are seeing with the low production of youth politicians and youth leaders emerging from the process is the outcome you're going to get.
All right, many thanks. But with this new bill for women in special seats for women, I think we'll be able to deal with some of these issues. So maybe we should also have special seats for young people.
Yes. If we have that, if we can succeed with the women, absolutely, there's no reason why we should not push it a step further.
To have special seats for young people.
To create that level playing ground. In fact, it's not really, that does not really equalize the space. It only makes an entry for some of those marginalized groups to begin to participate actively in the space. But beyond that, we have to go back to the process of demonetizing our politics.
That's a long process.
Is there a possibility that will demonetize our politics?
Yes, this is where even the reform agenda should be pushing towards. For example, INEC has a responsibility to monitor political, party campaign financing. The political parties are supposed to be reporting to INEC. This is a critical part of the governance of our electoral terrain. But we are not seeing that happen. And
why do you think why is that happening?
Why is that not happening? I think it also fits into what Jide Ojo talked about. The fact that we are we are doing this too much of bureaucracy
INEC is
for
independent
INEC at the federal level. And then we're not allowing the whole idea of democracy to percolate at the local level.
Okay, many thanks, Amsfree. So in other words, the Independent National Electoral Commission is actually independent, right?
It should be unbundled.
It should be unbundled.
It should be unbundled.
Anyways,
Yes.
I'd like to get to you,
Yes.
Mr. Ojo. We're about to round up this
That's what
conversation.
the report says. Yeah.
Earlier when you spoke, you talked about, this whole process not being necessary. It's about, strengthening what we already have and getting the actors to do the right thing. But there are some proposals. For example, the one that talks about inmates voting. You already kicked against the November election date. But you see, that is being proposed because the thinking is so that we can have all electoral matters dealt with before inauguration, just so that, whoever gets into position doesn't have to bother about electoral issues. Are these not credible proposals that you think we should push?
No, I've been privileged to observe elections across the globe in several countries, America, in Egypt, in Ghana, in Uganda. And so, and don't get me wrong, I didn't say the electoral reform is not necessary. I'm only saying we should not be fetish that every electoral cycle we have to do alterations and, it's not allowing us to even internalize and know which section is saying what, because a lot of, too dynamic action. Now, let me speak quickly to the issue you raised about concluding election before inauguration. Very nice idea. But Nigerian politicians are the ones that will still tell you that they were not giving fairness at the tribunal, because to do all of this in 6 months, in fact, in Uganda, do you know every election petition goes to the Constitutional Court and is supposed to be within 2 weeks? 2 weeks, not even a month. If you do that in Nigeria, the same political class opposition will say, "Oh, the reason why we will never win is because even before we gather evidence." How would you? Do you know our law, our jurisprudence talks about if you want to invalidate the outcome of an election, you don't say on TV or in court, "Oh, this election was rigged." What are the evidences? Now, the evidence will start from polling unit. And there are 176,000 plus polling units. So, assuming you are alleging that there is fraud in 50,000 polling units, out of 176,000, you are alleging fraud across 36 states in 50,000 polling units. The court expects you to bring incontrovertible evidences of that fraud in each of the polling units. That's one. Number two, you must lead evidence. There must be witnesses. So you cannot say, "Oh, this is see the result has been altered." Okay, fine. Do you have witness? And your witness must be credible witness. You cannot, in fact, this is a whole new discussion. You cannot say, I was there. I heard that they fixed the election in this unit or in this ward. Are you a poll agent accredited? Were you there throughout? Did you at any point leave to eat and whatever? The court will weigh those evidence. Now, how do you prove fraud in 50,000 polling units in 6 months? And each of the polling units, as you are presenting your exhibit and witnesses, the defendant will also have the right to cross-examine each of those witnesses. And you can see the length of time that is needed. So if you want to do all of this in 6 months, ahead of inauguration, God bless you. Because how do you calibrate? There are 3 layers for governorship and governorship election. It starts from election tribunal to court of appeal to Supreme Court. Are you going to abridge the time that in tribunal you spend 1 month or 3 months, in court of appeal 1 month, in Supreme Court 1 month. How do you deal with that? Then let me quickly land on the issue of same-day election. You don't even need to amend the law. INEC can deal with it administratively to say all the 2027 election will be held on the same day. There was no law that says INEC should have election on 2 Saturdays.
Okay, Mr. Jide, I have to pause you there because we have to return to Cynthia for just 1 minute. Okay. My producer said there is no time. It has been a very, very interesting conversation this morning. We are so sorry that Cynthia's network sort of went off and we couldn't return to her. Let me begin by thanking Amsri Ajanaku, Executive Director, Grassroots Center for Rights and Orientation. It's always been a pleasure having you. We hope to see you soon again as we continue to discuss this, as we go into the political arena very soon. And Jide Ojo, a public affairs analyst, always breaking it down for Nigerians to understand how things are. And joining us from our Kaduna studio is Dr. Aliu Yero, a political analyst. We thank you for your contribution. And Cynthia Mbamalu, Director Program Siaga Africa. Thank you so much for your contributions to this conversation. And I believe Nigerians watching have begun to understand how these things roll. Thank you so much for your time. On behalf of the crew, I am Juma Yusuf.
All right, I'll borrow Amsri Ajanaku's words. We're in a democracy. Be a Democrat. Sami and Ray John, live locked on the NTA.